Good evening or good afternoon if you're watching in North America. My name is Mike Krupa, and I would like to welcome everybody on this week's Heretics edition of the Votum TV podcast. And today we have the honor to have two very, very special guests. A few days ago, I wouldn't believe that we'd be meeting in this in a group such as this of esteemed American thinkers, strategists, and diplomats. Who will be with us for the next hour as we discuss very relevant issues pertaining to the geopolitical and international scene today, especially as it pertains to the situation in Ukraine. So first of all, I would like to introduce Chas Freeman. He is a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense and former United States Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. He was also Charge d'Affaires in Bangkok and Beijing, Acting U.S. Commissioner for Refugee Affairs and Director of Program Coordination and Development at the U.S. Information Agency. He was also the principal American interpreter during the late President Nixon's 1972 opening of U.S. relations with China. And Ambassador Freeman, in that light, I brought my special mug just for the occasion, my Nixon Now cup. So I hope it'll help us in our realist discussion this evening. And of course, our second guest, Douglas Macgregor, very well known to our viewers. He is the former advisor to the Secretary of Defense in President Donald Trump administration. He is a decorated combat veteran, author of 5 books, an all-around great strategic mind. Gentlemen, we were supposed to be joined this evening by editor-in-chief of Do Rzeczy, that is a center-right conservative weekly here in Poland. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Paweł Lysicki has said he cannot join us this evening, but he does send his regards and promises that he will try and update his knowledge of the current situation in Ukraine by watching this stream. So I think the fundamental question that has to be asked at this point, something that can have a double meaning, and I'd like to direct this first question to Ambassador Freeman. Was this war avoidable, and was this war unprovoked, as we are used to hearing? Ambassador Freeman, take it away.
The war is certainly unnecessary. It was provoked. It is brutal. It is illegitimate. And it has turned into a war of attrition, which at the moment nobody seems to have any great interest in ending. So it is a tragedy for Europe, and it is having huge effects on the global order, most of which are deleterious.
Doug, would you like to? Sorry about that. Yeah, I was on mute. Doug, unprovoked, avoidable. Your thoughts?
No, I think Ambassador Freeman's correct. This was eminently avoidable. But as I'm sure Ambassador Freeman can tell you in greater detail than I, we have a very bad habit of ignoring everyone's interests but our own, and we're not really sure what they are. And so we unfortunately consign responsibility for defining our interests to a small number of people in Washington. And that's what's happened in this particular case. No one in the United States was particularly interested in going to war with anyone, certainly not in backing a war against Russia. But we really didn't give Putin and frankly, his government much choice in the matter. Your viewers are certainly aware of the 14,000 people who died in the intervening 8 years before this intervention by the Russians began. Most of those were people living in Donetsk and Luhansk, and the breakaway republics, as they're called, and they were Russians. In addition to that, you had Russian citizens that were second-class citizens inside Ukraine, and they were being subject to this evil behavior of, we used to call it under the Tsar's Russification, now we call it Ukrainianization. This sort of thing had no future. Putin signed the Minsk agreements, and he was encouraged to believe that the Western powers would exert pressure on the Ukrainians to live up to their end of the bargain. All of that failed. We can go much further back. And of course, the largest issue for the Russians, they're certainly concerned about their citizens, was the emergence of this very large, extremely well-equipped, well-trained, powerful Ukrainian army, whose only rationale for existence was to first smash its way into the so-called breakaway republics and eventually reconquer Crimea. Those things are well known. And in fact, the Russians captured plans to that effect as they advanced into eastern Ukraine. It's tragic, but under those circumstances, if we faced something similar in Mexico, I think that we would have behaved very similarly to the Russians. Probably we would have been much harsher and exercised far less discretion with regard to the use of military power, which is our history. So all in all, it was avoidable. All we had to do was stand up and say, Russia has legitimate security interests in eastern Ukraine. All we had to do was tell Ukraine, its government, we will not support you until you guarantee equal rights for all your citizens before the law. These are not hard things to do, and the State Department likes to blow its horn about its advocacy for human rights. Well, there was an opportunity in Ukraine, and they ignored it completely. So the bottom line is, yes, it was avoidable. Yes, it's a tragedy. And I wish we didn't have it, but we've got it now. And I think it's going to get a lot worse, a lot quicker than people realize.
I want to go back to the few weeks before February 24th, 2022, i.e. in December 2021. We remember that the Russians put out two treaties, draft treaties, one to NATO and one to the United States. Now, I have to tell you, in Eastern Europe, in Poland, the mainstream media, our political elites, everybody interpreted those propositions coming from the Kremlin, which I remember seeing the then United States ambassador coming to the foreign ministry to pick up the draft treaties to have a look at them. It seems that they were interpreted as unrealistic, although the Russians later claimed that the American response was much more professional than the NATO response. The NATO response was basically apparently very childish. I've seen both responses, and I can testify, I'm pretty sure you gentlemen have seen them also, that the American response was much more mature in its tone, although very unconciliatory in many ways. However, Ambassador Freeman, what's your take on the realism of what the Russians were proposing? Were those positions so unrealistic that we had to go to war in order to show the Russians who's boss? What do you think?
Well, they were in an opening position in a proposed negotiation. Nobody starts a negotiation by coming to their bottom line. Essentially, we now have a situation in which there was a solution to the issue of the Ukrainian civil war, basically. I mean, there are 3 or 4 wars going on. One is among Western Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians and Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the East. Another is between the government in Kyiv and the government of Russia. Yet another is between the United States and Russia. And a fourth is perhaps NATO and Russia. So these are 4 different wars. The Russian proposals, which build on Minsk, the Minsk agreements, which were a proposal to keep the rest of so-called People's Republics in the East within Ukraine and preserve Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, although with a federal structure that would allow Russian speakers to use their own language and to educate their children in it, in their part of the country. This was, of course, we now know, put forward insincerely by the Germans and the French who negotiated it. So essentially, the United States, stiff-armed, refused a request for a negotiation. And that's the bottom line. Whether the proposal was, quote, realistic or not is beside the point. It was a proposal to talk, and we essentially refused to talk about the European security architecture. Let me make a point about that. I was the person who pieced together various parts of suggestions and ideas from others to put together the idea of the Partnership for Peace within NATO. That was 2 things. First, it was a path to NATO membership that asked those who wish to join NATO to develop the capability to contribute security rather than just consume it. In other words, to master the 3,000 or some portion of the 3,000 STANAGs, as they're called, the standardization agreements, for operational doctrine within NATO so as to become interoperable with other Europeans. And it also asked that those who aspired to membership in NATO conform to European norms of democratic oversight of defense budgets, transparency in their development, and the replacement of the Soviet-style military defense ministers with civilian defense ministers drawn from elections. So this was the proposal. It was a proposal for NATO membership process, but it was also a proposal for a cooperative security system in Europe. Part of it involved the US NATO Council, which was to give the Russians a role in Europe and to avoid the mistake that Europeans and Americans made after World War I, when instead of following the example of the Congress of Vienna and creating a concert of Europe, we excluded two of the great powers of Europe from any role in its management, Germany and Russia, with disastrous results in World War II. Just one last observation. Doug Macgregor mentioned that and I agree with him, that if anything similar to what we were doing in Ukraine had appeared in Mexico, we would have acted. Actually, we did do that. Most people forget that in the American Civil War, the French took advantage of our internal squabbles to install the Emperor Maximilian in Mexico, of which the only legacy of that is so-called mariachi music, mariachi being the Mexican Spanish pronunciation of mariage, or marriage in French. In any event, the minute our Civil War was over, we massed 40,000 troops on the Mexican border and informed the French that if they didn't leave, we would come after them. The French are smart, and they left, leaving Maximilian to his fate. A couple of years later, Benito Juarez, the great Mexican liberal, executed him with a firing squad. I don't think it's difficult to understand the concerns of the Russians about the placement on their borders and within their traditional cultural area of what is essentially a hostile force. And I think I agree with Doug Macgregor. They basically were left with little choice to react. I think they reacted stupidly and did something that was illegal under international law, and that they could have had alternatives. But they made the decisions they did, and we have to live with the results.
Doug, it seems that, and Ambassador Freeman alluded to this, the security zone, the proximity of foreign forces to your borders, to your country. There seems to be this persuasion among Western elites that Russia, because of its imperial past, is not entitled to a security zone. Russia cannot have a sphere of influence. That is something that is only reserved to Western powers, and especially the United States of America. What's your assessment of this type of thinking, which denies Russia, the basic tenet of any rational foreign and security policy?
Well, first I have to agree with Ambassador Freeman and point out that my Austrian friends are still saddened in disappointment by Maximilian's failure. They thought that they were going to annex Mexico, which would have been a wonderful opportunity for the Austrians, because they probably all would have migrated there in time and there wouldn't be anybody left in Austria. But that's another story.
Doug, instead of drugs, you'd be having more Wiener Schnitzel,
That's right. Now, all kidding aside, I don't think it's a question necessarily of a zone. The real question is, why have we taken this position that Russia is an existential threat to Europe or the United States? I mean, quite frankly, anybody who makes that assertion, it's evidence-free. If you go back and look at February, the first few days of the intervention, then look at what happens from March until about July or August. The Russians sent in very few forces. And several people said, oh, well, look at the Russians. They don't have very many forces, do they? Their army is too small. And they don't seem to be very good. Now, I don't agree with the not very good. I understand the constraints under which they operate because Putin took the position. We don't want to kill lots of Ukrainians. These are people just like us. We don't want to do a lot of property damage. We want negotiations. And he thought, wrongly obviously, that he could induce negotiations. Nobody was interested in talking. We don't need to go back over that ground. But that's the first thing. Is it because Russia doesn't qualify as a pristine liberal democracy? Well, if that's the standard, then Ukraine fails miserably and is worse now than it's ever been. Is it because Russia is too corrupt? Well, we've got lots of corruption in lots of countries, even in our own. This is nonsense. So where is the justification for treating Russia in this way? And then secondly, what are Russia's legitimate security interests? And I think you've stated them. They deserve to have a border area or neighbors that are not necessarily postured, organized, and equipped to attack them. That's not unreasonable. And the funny thing is, when all of this began, my friends that I served with at NATO all took the position that neutrality for Ukraine was a gift to the Russians and to Europe. What a wonderful thing. A nice, open, secure country that is neutral, where we can do business, where no one is threatened. The Russians feel safe from us. We feel safe from the Russians. What's the problem? But we know that was rejected out of hand. And as the ambassador pointed out, there has been no diplomacy. Whatever the Russians have said, we've dismissed out of hand. When anyone in their right mind would have taken whatever offer was there and said, thank you very much. On closer inspection, we see some good things. We need time to study it. In the meantime, while we study this, we'd also like to arrange talks. And then you do your horse trading or your discussion privately. There's too much public diplomacy because every congressman, every president wants to stand there, hurl abuse at the foreign enemy or alleged enemy, and somehow or another think he's going to endear himself to the American public. And here's the news. Most Americans could care less what happens in Ukraine. That's the sad truth.
Well, in light of this, and because of Ukraine, the president of the United States was in Ukraine and in Poland, just left a few hours ago, actually, on Air Force One. I want to touch upon my country, Poland's role in this entire conflagration, which has been very important because during the last 48 hours, we've been hearing a lot of commentary coming from people who are very critical, by myself being one of them, of the current government's position that Poland is becoming the second proxy vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, in the sense that whereas the main thrust of the proxy war, which has been acknowledged by all the major players that it is a proxy war, is Ukraine, that Poland is lining up to be proxy number two. And in light of this, I picked up this quote from the late Edward Gierek, who was the head of the Polish United Workers' Party in the late 70s. So this is a man who dealt with three presidents, in essence, President Nixon, President Ford, and President Carter towards the end of the 70s. He actually hosted President Nixon in 72, just after the visit in China. I think it was 2 months after, in June of 1972. And Gierek, in an interview in 1992, when asked about how newly reborn Poland should deal with the United States, stated the following, I quote, "Believe me, I have talked to 3 American presidents, and I know that for them, we are just pawns on the grand chessboard of world politics." Fairly controversial statement, but I'd like to get both of your thoughts, gentlemen, on that perspective in light of Poland's role in the current proxy war with Russia. Ambassador Freeman.
Well, certainly if the war spills out over the Ukrainian borders, Poland is the most likely place for it to spill out. That is clear. And it is very appropriate for the government of Poland to be a bit cautious about that. I think there's a couple of issues I'd like to speak to, which bear on this, if I may. One is geography. If you're Russian, or for that matter, a Pole, you are a prisoner of geography. There's nothing between Moscow and the Pyrenees except plains that are easily crossed by cavalry or modern equipment. There's nothing between Moscow and Kamchatka except frozen plains. If you're sitting in Moscow, or you're sitting in Warsaw, or in Berlin, you don't have any natural defenses of a geographic nature. And therefore, you have to be concerned about the orientation and alignment of your neighbors. There have been multiple instances of invasion of Russia, both by the Mongols, by the French, by the Germans, and so forth and so on. So there's a perfectly rational basis for Russian concern about denying Ukraine to NATO, which, after all, was, during the Cold War, a defensive alliance, but after the Cold War mounted several offensive operations, obviously in the former Yugoslavia, but also in Afghanistan and Libya. So I think the concerns that Poles have and Russians have a rational basis and need to be taken into account. A second comment is about spheres of influence. Rather than Russia trying to incorporate Ukraine into a Russian sphere of influence, I think it was attempting strategic denial. It did not want Ukraine incorporated into the US sphere of influence known as NATO. And I think that's very clear. Spheres of influence may be objectionable to us, except in the Western Hemisphere, where we have always asserted the sphere of influence. But the fact is that attempting to deny other countries spheres of influence in a global order that is increasingly disorderly and multipolar is not going to work. Therefore, I think, and I should say, by way of advertising, there's a new handbook of diplomacy out in which I have a chapter on spheres of influence, which are a very interesting diplomatic tool, not much examined. So I think the geography dictates caution on the part of those countries that don't have natural geographic defenses. And it also dictates caution on the part of those who would place forces next to them that threaten them. I think Poland is in a very awkward position. It always has been. I'm delighted as the father-in-law of a couple of Polish Americans that Poland is back as a great power in Europe. But I think it does need to be very cautious in this context.
Doug, your thoughts?
Well, the Poles are a charming group of people. They have a wonderful history, but much like Americans, they have difficulty learning from it. And Ambassador Freeman has pointed to the singular reality that however great Poland may be, whatever its aspirations are, it is, for better or worse, wedged between two great powers, really great powers, Germany and Russia. Germany and Russia have lots of reasons to cooperate, but that doesn't mean that Germany or Russia necessarily have any interest in capturing, conquering, and administering Polish territory. And I think people need to get that through their heads. I see no evidence that Putin wants anything to do with Western Ukraine. I mean, he feels compelled to do what he's done in the East. He may ultimately, and I think he probably will, his forces will take all of Eastern Ukraine as a security measure in all probability. But there's no interest in Western Ukraine. If you're a Russian, do you really want to manage lots of Western Ukrainians that hate your guts? That's a very unrewarding exercise. Do the Russians want to manage Poles? Do the Germans want to manage Poles? The answer is no and no. So let's put this 19th century imperialist thinking to bed. Stop talking about Europe as a chessboard. Then let's ask a couple of very key questions. I never hear anybody say this. What do the Ukrainians want? Have they held a referendum in that country? Did everyone stand up and say, yes, we want war with Russia? I would tell you that if you go back to Zelensky's election, when he ran on a peace platform, he was elected overwhelmingly by the population of Ukraine, including not all, but a substantial portion of Western Ukrainians, because they, as well as the Ukrainians in the East, wanted the same thing. They wanted peace. They didn't want revenge. They didn't want a revanchist war to retake Crimea. They wanted peace. Peace is essential to prosperity. So I think we can say safely, no one has really addressed that question. What is in the interest of the people that live in the country? And that applies to Poland. What do the Poles want? Has anybody asked them? You've got a government right now that is extraordinarily hostile to Russia and seems hell-bent for some sort of confrontation. That's catastrophic in my view, and it's unnecessary. So what do the Poles want? Somewhere along the line, people have to ask that question, and the Poles need to answer. So do the Ukrainians. It's a little late for Ukraine, tragically, as we know. There may be only 18 to 22 million Ukrainians left in the country at this point, and everyone who's come out says they will never go back. It's tragic. I don't know that Ukraine will even exist as a nation state when this is over, regardless of what peace arrangements are made. Who knows? But we don't want that fate to befall Poland. So I hope that someone in Poland will stand up and say, what do the Polish people want? Let's find out. Maybe they don't like the answer, but I suspect it will be peace and prosperity, not war with Russia.
Indeed.
I think we need to,
Go ahead, Ambassador.
if I may come in on this, I think we need to recognize that one way or another, Ukraine has been effectively partitioned. That Crimea is not coming back under any circumstances. And the Donbass is also, I think, lost to Ukraine. But we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. What will be left of Ukraine? Will it be viable? This gets to the loss of population, the fact that the major industries have been in the east, the fact that huge damage has been done to the country. I think people are dreaming if they think the European Union is going to come up with the money to repair all of that damage. But we don't know whether at the end of this, Odessa will be, you have to get a Russian or a Ukrainian visa to go there. We don't know. And so one question is, when this is over, however it ends, how does the Ukraine survive? That's pretty important to Poland, among other countries. The second question is, what sort of European security architecture do we anticipate? Is it one which is where Russia sits on one side of a DMZ, like in Korea, and the rest of Europe sits on the other side? Or is it something like what we envisaged in the Partnership for Peace, where, by the way, the working assumption was that the Ukrainians would be too smart to want to join NATO, because that would be such a provocation to Russia that it would have dire consequences, but that they would want to become militarily interoperable with NATO through the Partnership for Peace in case of some contingency. Everybody saw Ukraine as a buffer and a bridge between Russia and the rest of Europe. And the fact that it chose a different course under urging from successive American presidents is tragic. Joe Biden, who just visited Warsaw right before this war, said, I don't do red lines. I don't respect anybody's red lines. Well, that is pretty foolish. And we've seen the result of that. We now have people in our government, Victoria Nuland, for example, saying that the war must go on until Ukraine recovers Crimea. Well, when pigs fly, that will happen.
Just in line of those observations, I think in terms of the Polish government, the problem is the uncompromising view in a way is Victoria Nuland on steroids in a sense, because the message coming from both the presidential palace and the government and the prime minister is that Russia has to be completely defeated, an uncompromising total defeat. And the way they're framing the situation is that if Russia is not defeated, that would mean the end of European civilization, the end of the liberal West, and so on and so on. How they arrive at that conclusion is anyone's guess, but these are things not even, Jake Sullivan, Anthony Blinken, Toria Nuland are saying. And in essence, these are the people that Poland is hinging our foreign policy directives on. I mean, those three people, basically, unless we, believe in the fact, or non-fact rather, that President Biden has a firm hold on his foreign policy and his foreign policy team. So the sort of the strategic implications of what's been going on since February 2022 is the Americans say one thing and the Poles take it to the next level in a way. So we're sort of like the Rottweiler, the American Rottweiler here in Eastern Europe, being pulled back sometimes by the Americans, as was the case in the first couple of weeks when we proposed to give those MiG-29s to Ukraine. But, Anthony Blinken even stepped in and said, wait, that's going a little bit too far. We don't want World War III here. Now they're openly talking about it. So I don't know whether we're having an influence, but it's definitely a negative influence, or the tendency is such that, you radicalize over time. But in light of the speech that President Biden delivered last night in Poland, he continues to mention the world. The world is united against this aggression. Now, obviously, he seems to forget that the world also includes China, the Middle East, India. Ambassador Freeman, I'd like to pose this question again to you. China and the Middle East have been positioning themselves, or there's this expectation that they might be mediators in a peace proposal. Anthony Blinken was in Egypt a few weeks ago. They discussed the potential for restarting nuclear arms agreements with the Russians. We have the Russian response already. Actually, we got one yesterday. President Putin has suspended Russian participation in the START treaty. What do you think the Middle East countries and China can bring to the negotiating table and potentially resolving this war as soon as possible?
India, China, Brazil, other countries in Africa and Latin America, and the Arabs all want a multipolar world order. If Russia is humiliated and weakened, that order will not happen. What we will have is some sort of quasi-bipolar order between China and the United States. Nobody wants that. Therefore, when we say, that we must weaken and isolate Russia, there is people in the global south, as it were, outside Europe, beyond the G7, which is the club of former imperialist powers, all react negatively. That has no appeal at all. What they want is peace. They want access to Russian and Ukrainian resources, and they want Europeans to be able to devote their money to something other than fighting each other. Now, at the end of the week, probably on Friday, General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, will probably deliver a peace proposal. The danger is that will be rejected out of hand by the United States and others, simply because it's Chinese. Well, how can a country that, quote, aligns itself with Russia possibly mediate? Well, the answer is, first of all, China has been very careful not to align itself with Russia, but it has not aligned itself with the United States either. In fact, the Indians are more pro-Russian than the Chinese. Yeah. All the polling shows. So this is complicated. But it is not true that a mediator with a bit of sympathy for one side, and the Chinese do sympathize with the Russian view that they were pushed into this by NATO enlargement and the refusal by NATO and the United States to negotiate. It is not true that someone with that sympathy cannot mediate. I helped when I was on active duty in the U.S. Foreign Service. I helped to broker the withdrawal of Cuban forces from Angola, the independence of Namibia, the withdrawal of South African forces from Namibia, and an election process in Angola. There was no doubt during those mediation efforts, which were assisted by the UN and others, and in the latter stages actually by the Soviet Union, there was no doubt where America stood. And it was not with Cuba and Angola. And yet we succeeded. So I wouldn't rule this out, although I think there is a danger that if the Chinese feel that the United States is upping the ante with Russia and they think they're next, if we do weaken and isolate Russia, we'll go after them, that they will indeed do what Secretary of State Blinken has accused them of with no evidence whatsoever. They will indeed start to arm the Russians. And they could, if the Russians have some of the ammunition and equipment shortages that British intelligence keeps erroneously asserting they do, then the Chinese have the ability to make that up. So this is a very dangerous moment. The peace proposal, whatever it is, should not be rejected out of hand. It should become the basis for discussion. If the discussion goes nowhere, that's another thing. But if there's no discussion, I think this could be quite perilous.
Doug, can Xi Jinping make a successful intervention here?
I think under normal circumstances, he certainly could. Of course, I'm one of these people that tires of hearing people talk about the Communist Party because there aren't very many communists that I'm aware of still in China. The place can be described in many other ways, but I think it's important for people to understand that China's interest is not in waging war. It never has been. It isn't now. Whatever we don't like about the Chinese are very clear about their principal interest. That's business. And they want to build prosperity. To build prosperity, to do business, you need stability and peace in Central Asia, and that includes Ukraine. If you're going to make the one belt, one road work and do business with Europe, you've got to have uninterrupted lines of communication between Europe and China. I mean, that's Ambassador Freeman pointed to the nature of the landscape, and he's absolutely right. I mean, from the rail standpoint, even if you're going to use airships to move across that continent, is an extraordinary achievement if you can do it without warfare. The last time the world saw anything like that was under the Mongolian Empire. The Mongols controlled it, they imposed discipline, and prosperity thrived, frankly. Mongols don't usually get credit for that sort of thing, but it nevertheless is true. So my point is, yeah, I think we should listen, but we're not very good at listening right now. We tend to see the world as black and white. We have these ideological blinders on that essentially compel us to condemn everyone who does not readily submit to our will, who doesn't want to be part of a system that we obviously dominate thanks to our financial control of the globe. And we're already beginning to witness de-dollarization. We're watching the BRICS do that. The world is changing. It is multipolar. We seem to want to freeze this. In contrast to Ambassador Freeman, I'm afraid a lot of people in Washington would welcome the DMZ outcome because that would justify policies and expenditures and behavior that are completely unnecessary under normal circumstances. So if you turn around and say, well, there's no reason to go to war, you're going to make a lot of people very unhappy in the United States. And the other thing is, on this war topic, it seems to me that a lot of people in Europe now, as well as in the United States, have lost any sort of understanding of what the word means. They think it's something that happens on somebody else's soil, that nothing will touch them. That's not true. And they don't understand the Russian capacity to escalate horizontally. But again, we have to get people back to diplomacy. That means mutual respect, honoring interests. If you can honor other people's strategic interests, respect them, work towards mutual prosperity, then you get treaties, then you get trade arrangements, you get peace. We're nowhere near that at this point. And I don't think we're going to get there with leadership.
Doug Macgregor sounds very European to me. Americans have a way of war in which we demand unconditional surrender by the enemy and then propose to engage in the enemy's moral reconstruction. This was the pattern in our Civil War. It was what we tried to do in World War I. It was what we did in World War II. And it was arguably what we did during the Cold War. But most wars end in a negotiation in which whatever's been achieved on the battlefield is reconciled between the two parties. And I think Doug is absolutely right. We don't understand that adequately. Nobody has put forward clear war termination strategy. Nobody's even talking about it. It's, we got to go until President Zelensky can swim on the beaches in the Crimea again, as he said he would. We need to, I agree, we need to listen, we need to think, we need to understand that war creates realities that then require acknowledgement rather than rejection. We need to be setting the basis for a negotiated resolution of this, with which everybody's going to be unhappy, because nobody's going to get everything they want or even very much of it. But if the war goes on indefinitely, go back to Doug Macgregor's mention about transport across Eurasia, Poland is isolated. That DMZ, if that's what happens, is going to represent a perpetual threat to Poland. So what is now a historical memory of threat could become real again. And I think that would be catastrophic for Europe, for the world. And we ought to be thinking more broadly about how to end this war so that isn't what happens.
That is
Can I say one thing?
Go ahead, Doug.
In connection with that, the Europeans who have become accustomed to working with us and for us and aligning themselves with us have to take a very hard look at this business. The United States is in a position from which it cannot easily retreat. As the ambassador pointed out earlier, our presidents and the leaders here have made, in my judgment, a lot of outrageous demands and comments. They have insisted on conditions that will never be met. That puts us in a position where how could we possibly reach out to the Russians and lead talks and reach any sort of amicable solution? The Europeans can do that. They may have to change some of their leaders that they've currently got, but it's time for the Europeans, especially the Germans and the French. They're not the only ones. I hope people in Poland will start to think about this. Certainly the Swedes and the Danes are beginning to think about it. The Italians have, and the Austrians must. Everyone needs to think about their interests as Europeans. What is in the interest of the European peoples? It certainly isn't an endless war. It is not some sort of arrangement that transforms Russia into the permanent enemy of, quote unquote, the West. Far from it. In fact, we would like to do business with the West. That's my impression of most Europeans. So we've got to get this thing over with. They're going to have to take this whole business and run it. They're going to have to stand up and say, thank you very much, Washington. We appreciate your interests, but those are not our interests. Our interests are in peace, and we're willing to sit down and hammer out a solution. Now, we're a ways from that, but I wonder, once eastern Ukraine is completely under Russian control, if that's not going to sober people up. And if it doesn't, I imagine Russian forces approaching the outskirts of Lviv will, because let's be very clear. The Russians regard what happens in Ukraine as an existential matter for them. They're not going to stop halfway and say, fine, that's it. That's all we need today. We're going home. They're going to insist that the threat in Ukraine be removed. That can be removed very easily. That it is not the Ukrainian people. And this regime in Kiev is not necessarily representative of what Ukrainians everywhere want. So I think it can be done. The Poles have a role to play in that, but not as our proxy. They have to play a Polish role within the broader European framework.
Let me follow up.
Go ahead, Ambassador.
We're talking to each other too much, probably, but
No, that's perfect. That's the way I wanted
I
this
don't
to
want
work. Go ahead.
I don't want to keep picking on Austria and, Wiener Schnitzel with tacos and so forth. But I do think the Austrian State Treaty of 1955 stands out as a viable solution for Ukraine. It was always there. At the very height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union, the United States, the British and French removed their forces from Austria, and Austria agreed to be neutral and stay neutral, and not to join any alliance. And if we were able to do this at the height of the hysteria of the Cold War, why can't we do it now? The answer, I think, lies in what Doug was talking about, namely poor leadership, misguided people, people with hubris who imagine they can have their way regardless of what the other parties think. And I agree with him that the solution to this essentially European problem must be worked out primarily by Europeans. I hope my country, the United States, will support that effort, but I'm not at all confident we will, given where attitudes are at the moment.
I'm going to throw this thought out there, gentlemen, because you've provoked this line of thinking. But if the Europeans were to reassert what sometimes Emmanuel Macron alluded to, and even at the Munich Security Conference, of all places, about European strategic autonomy, which basically other people interpret as bye-bye NATO. If the Europeans were to reassert themselves, at least the major European players, so Germany and France and possibly Italy, Orban is already doing this in a way, but wouldn't this strategic autonomy and moving to reassert European independence mean that it's the Austrians calling, I think.
I think so, to protest, yes.
Would not this mean the dismantling of NATO immediately or over time?
I don't think so, but I think NATO is essential for several reasons. It's essential for Europe because it is a means of enabling European cooperation on common problems. A very powerful Germany sitting at the center of Europe, when it's in NATO, is not threatening to its neighbors as it has been in the past. And I think the United States and Europe are in a single geopolitical zone. The United States needs to continue to be involved in Europe. What it doesn't need to do is to do what Europeans should do for themselves, namely provide an adequate defense. So I would myself be in favor of Europeanizing NATO and moving the United States to the background. Because, as an American, I think I look at the 20th century and I see Europeans dragging us into wars on several occasions, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, if you will. I don't think we want that to happen, so I think we need to keep a hand in and play a balancing role and help the Europeans deal with a powerful Germany and with a Russia with one foot in Europe and one outside. So I think I think this is a reasonable proposition, and there's no need for NATO to disappear as such, but it needs to be transformed.
Doug,
if I could just say, Europeanizing NATO is something that a lot of us thought should have happened in the 90s instead of what occurred.
Mm-hmm.
We weaponized NATO, turned it into an offensive instrument. We started with this ridiculous notion, if it's not out of area, it's out of business. Forgot that the NATO alliance was essentially defensive and designed to promote stability and prosperity in Europe. Instead, we did all of the wrong things. Now, my concern is that as this war drags on, it will become tougher to do that because more and more Europeans are going to look not only at each other, but at Washington and say, we don't want what you're doing to us. I mean, if they see the Russians cross the Dnieper and begin to move west, I think the Europeans are going to look at that and say, this would never have happened had Washington been willing to talk to Moscow. So then the question is, if Washington won't do it, we have to do it. And if we do it, do we really need Washington? See, at this point, I think there's still a chance for what Ambassador Freeman said. But the longer this goes on, the less likely that outcome is. Because let's face it, we have very severe problems here in the United States that we have essentially ignored for decades. These proverbial chickens are coming home to roost. It's not going to be easy getting out of the mess we're in. And a lot of Americans are going to say, well, listen, we've had it with this. We've got to fix our own borders. We've got to fix our own society. We've got to protect ourselves. So I see forces moving against what Ambassador Freeman describes, which is, in my judgment, the desirable outcome. But if this does not stop soon and it drags on, then I think we're out of business, frankly. The status quo is gone.
I think one of the issues that fits perfectly with what was just said is that bombshell report by Cy Hirsch from a few days back. Because in essence, if we were to believe, I'm not talking about the so-called Tom Clancy technicalities of what Cy Hirsch wrote, how the C4 was planted, the naval operations and so on. But if it turns out that it was, in essence, the decision of the President of the United States using American covert operators and parts of the Navy to destroy a critical piece of infrastructure of a NATO ally, wouldn't that mean that the United States basically declared war on Germany? Ambassador Freeman.
Well, I would say that Cy Hirsch has a stellar reputation as an investigative reporter, beginning with the exposure of My Lai massacre in Vietnam and the subsequent exposures of Abu Ghraib, and I find his report entirely credible. Whether the details are correct or not is as you suggest, essentially a trivial matter. It is certainly no means of alliance management. It is coercive. It is potentially explosive in terms of the relationship with Germany, in particular, the rest of Europe as well. But Germany has a central role in Europe, and the idea that you could cut off its energy supplies in order to make a strategic point that has been repeatedly discussed between the German and American governments, and which German views are very clear, and they did not agree with the American efforts to stop Nord Stream. So, to do this is the height of diplomatic ineptitude and potentially catastrophic.
Doug?
No, I agree completely with the ambassador, and I would point out that just as we fail to appreciate Russian concerns, interests, and feelings, we are not appreciating the impact on Germany. The German population has not missed this. You're talking about a very educated population that follows the news and information. They know what's happened, and there is a quiet sense of rage directed not at Moscow, but at Washington, growing inside German society. And I think this is unfortunate for us, but Ambassador Freeman is exactly right. We behave badly. Can we recover from it? I don't know. Again, it's a question of how long does this drag on? The sooner we get it over with, the less damage it will have done to us. The longer it lasts, the more damage there is to Europe and to the United States, in my judgment, unnecessary damage to the alliance.
We are, in our media, completely silent about this. It's not mentioned.
It's the same in Eastern
Europe.
Europe.
Very sad commentary on the state of the press in our society. We are We are prisoners of our own propaganda.
I mean, 10, 15 years ago, would the New York Times, Washington Post be ignoring a story by Cy Hirsch? It's inconceivable, basically, but it is. We are where we are. Gentlemen, last question, because we did touch upon China. We touched upon multipolarity. Ambassador Freeman, as you were the top U.S. diplomat and representative in Riyadh during Operation Desert Storm. You know the country very well, and we've noticed that after the 24th of February 2022, not only has the tone of relations between the United States and Russia gone totally downhill, but we're seeing other countries, typically considered traditional allies of the United States, pivot, well, maybe not pivot, too strong of a word, but start moving slowly towards the Russian position. We've heard that Saudi Arabia is interested in joining BRICS. Even Israel, with all its clout in the United States and the Israel lobby and the influence it wields, has taken a fairly balanced position, at least until this point, regarding the war. I mean, Naftali Bennett was for a time considered a mediator, and he spilled the beans a few days back by telling basically the Israeli audience that it was the Western diplomats that sabotaged the peace talks, which is another confirmation of what we knew thanks to Fiona Hill and other people before him. But where do you see, is this a genuine move on the part of Saudi Arabia? Or are we seeing a divorce, a final divorce between Riyadh and Washington in terms of a very clear geopolitical vector towards which Saudi Arabia is potentially going?
American dominance of the Middle East, which was a phenomenon of the Cold War, is essentially over. Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, other countries now act on their own interests as they see them, without checking first with the United States, and they don't defer to our requests. If you want an example of that, you can look at the Israeli reaction to our criticism of their settlement expansion, which is to blow us a raspberry. You can look at the Saudi response to President Biden's request to do something to lower the price of gas at the pump before the midterm elections. And the fact that he actually had to go to Riyadh to ask for, with gas can in hand, to ask for relief and got none, tells you something. What I see happening in the world at large is the end of the 500-year-long European-American hegemony and the emergence of independent centers of power that act on their own interests, often without any regard for ours as we define them. And I think one of the problems we have is that we apparently continue to assume that we have the unbridled sway and the followership that we did during the Cold War. But now, to take the example of the Saudis, we were always able to finesse their disagreements with us over the Israel-Palestine issue because we had a common enemy in the Soviet Union, and in the case of the Saudis, atheism, which was one of the main motivators for them to align with us. So that's over. We're not playing our hand very well in this context, in my view.
No, I'm gonna let Ambassador Freeman have the last word on that, and I agree with him 100%. And I've got to go.
Okay. Well, that is a good ending, so to say, a very diplomatic ending. But yeah, we were planning this for about an hour, and I think we did good. I hope we can do this soon. It was an honor to have you, gentlemen. For our viewers, our guests today were former U.S. Ambassador in Saudi Arabia, Chas Freeman, and former advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense under President Trump, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Gentlemen, it was an honor. Hope to see you soon. And we'll be observing the world, I think, to bring some new insight to our viewers in the upcoming weeks. Thank you once again, and hope to see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Keep well.
Thank you.